Okay, so you'll have the event construct here. I think you can use pre-construct as well. I'm not sure what the difference is, but I don't think it matters. But stick to event construct if you can. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be creating two random numbers for x and y that will be used as the targets uh, to hit. So every lock is going to be different because every time we try, it's going to be a random number that we have to hit for x and y. So this will generate a random float in range between 0 and 15 for the x-axis because the angle of our uh, right lockpick can only go up to 15 degrees. Okay, so uh, one float equals 1 degree, so to speak. And for the y, because the angle is set between 0 and 50 degrees, we're going to set a random float generated between 0 and 50. Okay, and so you'll also want to get your player controller. You just got to type out get player controller and drag off of here to show mouse cursor. You want to set that to true because when the game begins, we want to see the mouse cursor. Okay, so that's it for the event construct. It's just generating a random number between 0 and 15 for the x and 0 and 50 for the y. So we're going to use the event tick for our game. It's going to be constantly checking where our mouse is going. So as soon as you load up this widget, it's going to be following your mouse all the time. And basically, it's assigning a value to your X position and your Y position. And when the X position is equal to this number, it's going to start vibrating. And when the Y position of your mouse is equal to this number, it's going to start vibrating. Now, if both lockpicks are vibrating and you double click, okay, on button double click, if both buttons are vibrating, it's going to move to true and it's going to play the unlock sound and it's going to set off our unlock event. If it's false, it's going to set off our break lockpick event. And I'm just going to show you this real quick and I'll come back to it later. So the break lockpick event plays the break sound. It removes the widget from our viewport. It clears our timer function, and uh, it sets the game mode back to game instead of UI. So for now, let's just focus on the event tick. So first things first, you'll want to get your player controller and you'll want to get the mouse position. Okay. And out of this, you'll want to make a vector. I'm sorry, you'll want to make a vector 2D. We only need the X and Y, not the Z, because it's a two-dimensional game. Then you're going to promote this to a variable, and you're going to call it mouse position. Okay. So basically, this is checking your player controller's mouse position's X and Y value and setting it as a variable. And it's constantly changing because it's connected to the event tick. Okay, so every time you move your mouse, this will be set to a different, uh, this variable will be set to a different value and it'll equal what your mouse position is at the time. So we're going to split this, okay, or break it Because we want to normalize it before we want to normalize it uh, we uh, before we set the angles. Okay, and the reason we want to do that is because we want to just break it down to a more simple a simplified range. So because every screen is different, so you could have a big screen, you could have a little screen. We basically want to break it down to a percentage and simplify it to a simplified value of 0 to 100, or basically simplify it to a range of 0 to 1, so that the top of your screen is 0 and the bottom of your screen is 1. Okay, so just drag off of the mouse position pin and break vector 2D, and drag off of each of these pins and click normalize to range. Okay, and set 0 and 100 to each of these. 0 to 100 to each of these, the X and Y axis. And you're going to make a vector again out of this value, this normalized value. We're going to recreate this vector and set it to x-axis, and the y, we're going to set it to y-axis. You could just drag off the pin and click promote to variable. Okay, now connect all of these together. And this might look like a bit of spaghetti, okay, but if I just clean it up a bit for you, you'll be able to see better. Okay, so what we're doing is we're going to grab the lockpick left variable. Okay, now if you don't have this variable here, it's because you didn't check your variable up here. So we want to make sure that lockpick left is a variable, and we're going to just drag it into the screen like this. Okay, and we're going to drag off of it and set render transform angle. Oops. Set render transform angle. Okay. So the angle is going to be clamped. Okay, so if you drag off the angle and you go clamp angle, we'll set it from 0 to 50. Okay, because 50 is the max angle that I want it to be able to bend. So if I grab the pivot, if I grab the angle here, you'll be able to see 0. So this is its initial position, and 50 is the max position. So I don't want to be able to go below 0, and I don't want it to go above 50. Okay, so what you set it at here doesn't matter because it's going to be changed in real time anyways. Okay, so lockpick left, set render transform angle, and set the angle to clamp 0 to 50. And for me, I found that it worked best if I multiplied the y-axis by 6. Um, it's just a number that I played around with for a while before I found that this was my sweet spot that I liked with this setup. Feel free to experiment, but you could just copy this. Okay, so you can just drag the y-axis. This is a variable that we created here. You can just drag this y-axis here, drag off of this and break the vector. And just for the y, because we're only doing the y, you're going to multiply it by 6 and connect it into your angle degrees here. Okay. we're going to do the same for the lockpick right. We're going to set the x-axis. We're going to break it, and in the x, we're going to clamp the angle between 0 and 50 and set that to the render transform angle for the lockpick right. No need to multiply the x-axis, it works just fine as is. Then we're going to start a sequence. To get a sequence, all you need is to type in sequence and enter. The reason I want a sequence is because I don't want these two to be dependent on the previous one. So if I set this to be followed here, I would have to go through the first branch to be able to access the second branch, but that's not what I want. I want them both to be firing at the same time. So I want this to happen and then this to happen, regardless of the fact that I cleared this branch or not. So the first branch is for the y-axis or the left lockpick. Okay. So I'm checking. I'm checking. I'm checking if my mouse. I'm sorry. I'm not checking if my mouse is in the right location here. I'm checking if the random number that I generated in the event construct. So where it says where in the event construct where I said that I want to set a random number between 0 and 15 and 0 and 50. Those are my two variables. Okay, so in this particular case, let's say that random range of y was 7, or let's make it a little higher, 27 and yes, this is just for the y. Okay, so this, if it's true that my left lockpick's angle is in the sweet spot, is just 3 points higher than the sweet spot or just 3 points lower than the sweet spot. So this gives me a range of 6 total degrees from my sweet spot. So it doesn't have to be exactly my sweet spot. It starts to wiggle. So it starts to it takes the angle and it adds either just a half degree or minus 1 degree. It's constantly ticking and adding these tiny little values if it's in the range, in the sweet spot range. And by adding and removing these tiny little values, it makes it look like it's jumping back and forth. So just to show you what I mean quickly. Okay, so I click and now so it looks like my range, so this is max is 50 and the bottom is 0, so it looks like my sweet spot's probably around 40. And remember I set either +3 or -3, so let's say my sweet spot is 40. Then if my angle is either 30, as low as 37 or as high as 43, it's gonna start changing randomly changing the angle by half or 1 degree up and down so that it looks like it's wiggling. It looks like it's applying a pressure here. Do you see it? That fake pressure is being created, like I said, when the angle of my lockpick is within 6 points of my random number. then it goes to true, and now I set I'm setting uh, my render transform angle of my left lockpick to be randomly jumping by half a degree. And this is going to be continuously happening until I move my mouse out of this sweet spot. And once I move it out of this sweet spot, it's going to trigger the false now, no longer trigger the true. And so I'm doing the exact same thing with the with the right lockpick. Okay, so it does this, and then it does this. So it's doing both at all times. Okay, so it's basically always ticking false until it ticks true, and it will only tick true if my mouse is, or my mouse technically, if the angle is inside this range. Okay, so I made the X range a little smaller, just a range of max range of 2, so either +1 or -1 of the random range, because I only have 15 degrees to play with here as opposed to 50 up here. So if the angle of my lockpick is within my sweet spot range, then I will start to wiggle up and down. Okay, same thing as the other one, just this is the right lockpick and this is the left lockpick. Now, if it's true, I'm going to start the timer by function name, and my timer is basically just the number winding down. So I've got two different timers here, which affects the same variable. I just didn't want to use the same trigger, so I duplicated a function. Okay, so I just created a new function by clicking here, and I created a new variable. It's just a regular integer, and I set it to 5. Okay, so it's 5 seconds. This is my timer counter, and basically when this function is triggered, it removes 1 from the counter every 1 second. So set timer by function name. Okay, you just type it out, set timer by function name. It's got the function name, which is literally the name of the function. Okay, so you just copy this here, copy and paste it in there, so it's exactly the same. You want to make sure it's looping because it's infinite until the game is over, and you want to set it to 1 second because every second it's going to take off 1 point from my timer counter. So it's like a clock essentially. It's just a fake clock. Okay, and when the timer reaches 0, we're gonna do our break lockpick function. So once the countdown is inactive, so you want to set this off the false pin here. Okay. So once the uh, once the once the function is set, it will start to remove 1 second from the timer counter, and if the timer counter is 0, it goes to break lockpick. Okay. Same thing with the countdown timer X. It's the exact same function, and it goes to break lockpick as well. So break lockpick. I found a sound for a lockpick, or it sounds like a lockpick breaking. Okay, so I'm playing that sound at location, and the sound location is just my player character's location. So it plays just where you are. So on break lockpick, I want to play the sound. I want to remove this widget because remember we're inside a widget, so it can be self here. You don't need to assign a widget. You can just remove this widget. And this part is specific to my game. So I'm just closing the chest pickup widget that opens when I touch a chest, okay, or when I interact with a chest. So you won't necessarily need this part for your game, but I'm just kind of showing you everything either way. All you need to remember is that you need to remove the widget, the mini game widget from the viewport, and you do that with remove from parent when you break a lockpick. And then you want to clear the you want to set the game mode back to game. Set the input mode back to game instead of UI, and you can do that by adding your player controller first and then dragging off of the player controller and set input mode to game only. And off of the player character as well, you want to remove your mouse cursor and you want to clear those functions, okay? Because once you break your lockpick, you want the timer to go back to 5 or 10 or whatever you set your timer to. If you don't clear the timer, literally just type in clear timer by function name and set the same function that you had set, and it's going to stop the timer from ticking. Otherwise, it's just going to go on. This part is just a sound. It's just for sound. But if you want to have a sound of your lockpick scratching around as you move it, you can do this as well. Basically, I'm getting the input mouse delta. Delta is just its movement. Okay, so if my mouse movement x is bigger than one single unit. So if it's moving, essentially, so if my mouse x is moving or my mouse y is moving, then I'm going to play the sound once. I'm going to play the scratching sound that I have, and I'm going to wait half a second, and then I'm going to reset it. Okay, so if I don't do a do once loop, every time I move my mouse by one, it's going to start to sound over, and it's going to be super annoying. Okay, if you just want the sound to play once every half a second, my sound is exactly half a second, then it's going to play it in a continuous loop as you move your mouse, as opposed to restarting over and over and over every single time you move by one little unit. Okay, so that's it for the setup other than the success. Okay, so now we have our ticking function that follows basically everything we're doing and sets the lockpicks to move with the mouse. And we have our fail event if we fail. Now let's take a look at the success event, which is basically on double click. Okay, so every widget has overridable functions called mouse events. So you can just click on override under functions here, and you can go on mouse. No, sorry, on double. Maybe because I already have it set up, it's probably not registering anymore. But if you go on mouse double click, it comes up and it brings this event up.